Hello everyone, my name is Calvin and welcome back. Today we're going to be revisiting our Ansible AWX install guide. We had originally done this in a live stream format, and which was great for communication back and forth, asking questions and seeing things go wrong and how to troubleshoot. But ultimately, all that proved, in my perspective, to be a distraction from the actual installation guide. So today I'm going to walk you through a bare bones install of Ansible AWX. I'm going to be deviating from the developer's installation guide for a specific reason I'll talk about here. But instead of their preference for using Minikube, we're going to be deploying a actual Kubernetes environment. This is going to enable, first of all, the service to be available upon reboot. Second of all, other users on the network can access it. And honestly, I just think it's an easier approach than to use something like Minikube. Minikube is great for developers who need to spin something up and then change some code and then, kind of redeploy it. But for us, in this case, I need it to be accessible by others on my environment and from external services like Slack and ServiceNow. Going to need to be able to hit that Ansible AWX. So I feel like this approach by using Rancher to deploy Kubernetes is significantly better. All right. Now, a little bit about my environment. I'm going to be using a virtual machine within VMware's vCenter. Now, if you're using Workstation, VMware Fusion, KVM, VirtualBox, Vagrant, doesn't matter, but it's got to be a Linux distribution to run Kubernetes. There are Linuxy things that Kubernetes expects, things like system paths, directories, binaries, etc. So Kubernetes does require you to be running inside of a Linux environment. So we're going to be doing this deployment based on a vanilla Ubuntu 20.0.4 Linux install. Nothing really done to it, so that you have a good enough context as to kind of what the order of operations is to be successful here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to log into my VMware vCenter, and I'm going to look at my virtual machine that we're going to be deploying Ansible AWX upon. In this case, my virtual machine's got 4 CPUs, it's got 8 gigs RAM, and a 60 gig hard drive, which by today's standards is not really a whole lot. You probably can find that amount of resources to carve out of your system in order to kind of follow along here. Or you can just do the cloud. That's always an option too if you've got the money for it. So I'm going to log in here into my Linux install, my Linux distribution here. And there's an important piece of information I want us to kind of gather. And that is this IP address that we have right here. There's a whole lot of information that kind of is presented here in this message of the day banner that Ubuntu provides you. Some of it is garbanzo beans, don't need to worry about it, but really this middle section here is the meat and potatoes. And specifically for our case, we want to grab that IP address that's presented here, because that's what we're going to be accessing that's the IP address we're going to be SSHing into. And it's also going to be the IP address that we use to access Ansible AWX from a web browser. So make a mental note of that IP address before you proceed. Now, here's where I'm going to start recommending some alternative ideas to what we had done previously. Specifically, I'm going to be using a product called Microsoft Visual Studio Code to not only handle the SSH connection to this virtual machine, but also to create files that will be required for us to spin up Ansible and Kubernetes and those types of things. So the very next step that I'm going to take here is I'm going to reach out to my friend Google, and I'm going to look up Microsoft Visual Studio Code downloads. And this is a product that's open source. It's cross-platform, so it doesn't really matter if you're on Linux, Windows, or Mac, or anything else in between. There will be a install binary here selected for you. Now in my case, I'm on Windows, so I'm going to be using the Windows install and actually already have it installed on my system. So I'm just going to skip a few steps. I'm going to take for granted that you know how to go through a standard Microsoft install process. As you can suspect, it's a lot of next, done type of things. All right. Now, after we have Visual Studio Code open, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look to the right-hand side of my window here, and I'm going to look for these little square boxes, and that's where the extensions can be installed. I'm specifically looking for an extension called Remote SSH. Now, this is owned and maintained and developed by Microsoft, so don't feel too nervous about installing the extension. It is a Microsoft extension into a Microsoft product. You can have a nice little warm comfort blanket that you're not going to download anything malicious here. Now, this extension is critical for us. What it enables us to do is have Visual Studio Code connect to the remote server, the Linux server, over that IP address that we had grabbed earlier. And so what it does is it changes the entire context of Visual Studio Code to make it look and feel like you're operating on your local machine, but in reality, Visual Studio Code has an SSH connection to the remote server. So what we get with this is that we have the ability to do things like open up a command line terminal, bash, issue all the commands on the remote server, but just do it locally within our own environment. So after installing it, you're going to look to the bottom left of your screen here for the open remote window. And in my case, I like to select connect current window to the Windows host. And there are a couple of different options there. Basically, the connect current window to the remote host basically will prevent Visual Studio Code from opening up another instance of Visual Studio Code just to manage that remote session. Now in this case, I'm going to select add a new SSH host. We only have to do this one time. As you can see, the previous sessions that I've SSH'd into, they stay cached here. But in this case, let's just walk through a vanilla install. So I'm going to say add a new SSH host. I type in my command SSH, my username, and I look again at that IP address that we had captured after the VM had successfully booted up and we logged in. I'm going to select my SSH key, although it's not already on the remote system. Visual Studio Code just needs something to go off of. And then in the very bottom right-hand corner of our page, after we've entered all the required information, Visual Studio Code will give us a pop-up and say, hey, there is a new host added. Would you like to open the configuration, maybe make some changes, or would you like to connect to it? And that's what we're going to select. We're going to say connect to that remote host, which again will then have Visual Studio Code build the SSH session to the remote device after you've entered your password here, and will enable you to look around and feel like you're directly consoled into that remote host, but you're just doing it through Visual Studio Code. Super, super slick. Really love this kind of workflow. So the next thing for us to do is we're going to open up the remote systems terminal by hitting the tilde, which is underneath the escape key for all of you. For those like me that just had to look where it was placed on the keyboard, it's directly underneath the escape key. It's the tilde. If you're in another country, it might be something else. I don't know. And so after you hit that key, you're going to get a pop-up window at the bottom, and it's going to take up about half of your screen by default. Now, what I like to do is I like to maximize this by hitting the up arrow on the right-hand side. This will take the terminal and make it full screen. And yes, you can click the down arrow to kind of revert that, and you can even click the X to close the terminal out. But this is where we're going to be spending most of our time, so it's good to at least kind of get comfortable with that. Now, and the very first thing, and this isn't required, but this is the very first thing I like to do when I've got a brand new Linux install, is I like to just run an update and an upgrade on the system. Basically telling the Linux system, hey, go ahead, look to see if there are any new packages out there that I need to grab, and then go ahead and perform the upgrade. And we do that by typing in sudo apt update. And I like to concatenate the two commands together. So 2 ampersands and then sudo apt upgrade -y. And you'll see in my case, there's reaching out to all the remote packages, and it looked like it had one, which was libfirewall udp plugin 1 needed, or is telling me that it's was installed but is no longer required. All right, so we're good to go. I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen now. And now for us to install Kubernetes, let's go ahead and move to the official documentation. So back in my web browser, I'm going to browse over into the Rancher documentation. And there is a single curl command that will get Kubernetes up and running within your environment. Now, let's pause, time out for a second. This is not a Kubernetes conversation. Kubernetes is a requirement for Ansible AWX. There are good reasons for that, specifically execution environments. However, we are going to be really sticking with a single host, so non-clustered Kubernetes. It's very, very lightweight, but it doesn't have like things like high availability or scale out functions or anything along those lines. So just know that, yes, we're installing Kubernetes, but don't get too worried. It's, again, as you can see, it's just a single command, and it's not going to be akin to some of the larger Kubernetes scale out deployments, which get pretty difficult. All right, so again, we're just going to go ahead and copy this curl command here, and we're going to return to Visual Studio Code and paste it in here. Now, what this does is this grabs a remote script from get.k3s.io, and then it pipes the script to the output of a shell command. So it's basically a way to download and execute a script all at once. And what this is actually doing is, amongst other things, it's grabbing a bunch of Kubernetes binaries that are required, things like kubectl and others. And it's also creating the right directories, creating config files. And probably most important, at least I think so, is that it creates the Kubernetes process as associated to systemd, which is a fancy way of saying you can control whether or not Kubernetes starts up on reboot, or whether it's on or it's off. You can disable it. You can do all those things from the traditional systemctl within a Linux distro. So very, very nice, very, very handy. Within that single curl command, we've got Kubernetes up and running. So again, not too difficult. There's a lot to Kubernetes, but we're not going to go down there. Now, I want to check out the version of my Kubernetes install, just to validate that it's working properly. So I'm going to type in this command, kubectl -- version. And it looks like that is the incorrect command because I get some help context that comes back. The Kubernetes binary comes back and says, hey, listen, you passed in -- version, but we don't recognize that. And it doesn't recognize it because it's not the right command. The right command here is kubectl version. So we'll go ahead and update this. And when we execute it, we get an error message that comes into our screen. That error message isn't to say that Kubernetes isn't online and working or that something's broken. Instead, it's saying, hey, look, there's a file that kind of maps out your Kubernetes environment. It's stored in etc rancher k3s.yaml, and your permissions as a user are not sufficient to operate that file. So fair enough. We will need to make some changes on the permissions of that file. But first, before we do that, let me just make sure that we can use sudo to get elevated privileges, again, just to validate that Kubernetes is actually up and operational. So I'm going to run the same command, this time with the word sudo in front of it to get me elevated privileges. And we get some output that looks like it's all hunky-dory. Okay, so the first thing let's go ahead and look at the permissions of this file. So if we type in ls-lsa and the name of the file, what it's going to do is it's going to present us with the path of the file, but also all the permissions that are associated to it. Now, when we issue this, we can see that it's owned by the root user within the root group. That's how you see the words root right next to it. And that's fine as long as you have root privileges, but I don't natively. So I want to actually change this file to be open and readable and editable by myself. Now, your environment is going to be different. Your username is going to be different. Your groups are going to be different. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and type in the who am I command, and I'm going to get the name of my current user. In this case, it's C. And I'm going to look at groups, and I'm going to find out what groups my username is associated with. And as I can see here, C. is one of those. And I'm going to go ahead and make this etc rancher k3s YAML file. I'm going to make it editable by myself based on my permissions. So I'm going to type in a command, sudo change ownership, type in my username, a colon, and then my group, and then the path of the file. In my case, that's c.:c. and then the path of our our Kubernetes config file. Now, when I issue the commands kubectl version, I get that same output that we got when we had issued it before within elevated privileges. This is just a way of preventing you from having to type in sudo every single time. I want to check the status of my environment. So I'm going to say kubectl get nodes. And we can see the output here as I see my host name. I see the status is ready. I can see the role that this device plays and the version and how long it's been up and operational. Cool. Let's check to see if there's any workloads that are running right now on my Kubernetes environment. There should not be any, but we'll just go ahead and type in this command here, kubectl get pods. And we can see that there are no resources found in the default namespace. Now, I just want to focus on those last two words for a second. Default namespace, think of this, put your network engineer hat on for a second, and think of a namespace as a VRF in the routing world, right? It's a virtual router. So you can have things like overlapping objects or overlapping prefixes in a VRF, and it's all just associated within this virtual context of a namespace. Same idea here within Kubernetes. We have a default namespace, and you have the opportunity of creating other namespaces, and then you can store your resources within those namespaces. It greatly simplifies operating at scale. In our case, we're probably just going to be using the AWX namespace, but again, it helps you keep things nice and clean. It helps you allocate resources to the appropriate spaces. All right. In our case, again, we had no workloads currently in our default namespace. So the next thing for us to do is to revisit the documentation for Ansible AWX. Again, we're going to skip through all their Minikube installs because I don't think it's necessarily fit for our purpose here. But what they do have is they have a link to install Kustomize. Now, Kustomize is a tool that's going to help us build a Kubernetes environment based on some parameters that we pass. And what we're looking for specifically, Ansible AWX is going to need to have what's called an AWX operator. And the operators is what it's going to handle the actual download and installation and provisioning of Ansible AWX inside of your Kubernetes environment. The way that I like to think about this, there's Kustomize, and then there's the AWX operator, and then there's the actual AWX application that we're going to be hosting. The AWX operator, to me, is kind of like an architect, right? It's like you go out to an architect to say, hey, I want you to build something. Come over here. And the architect's like, okay, I'm over here. I'm ready for some kind of instructions on what you're looking to build. And then we will pass that operator a file, and that which will tell it exactly how to build our Ansible AWX environment. And at that point, the operator will go and it'll download the necessary components. It'll spin things up in the appropriate fashion, connect things together. And at the end of the day, we've got a working building in the terms of architect, but in our case, we'll have a working installation of Ansible AWX. But before we can reach out and grab that architect or that operator, for this analogy, we need to have something like Kustomize that will enable us to go out and grab that or reach out and grab that operator. So Kustomize is a part of the Kubernetes package as well. It's just an additional binary that we'll need to download from the internet. So I highly recommend going to first going to Ansible AWX, click on the Kustomize link, go to the installation guide, click on binaries, and then grab this curl command. I'm not going to read it all out because it's really long. And then paste that back into your environment. Now, that gives us the customized binary on our Linux host. But what I need to do is I need to move that binary to somewhere within my Linux install that is within the path. And basically, if you've never worked in a Linux world before, there's a subset of directories that your Linux operating system will look for an executable for a command that you type. So I need to move customize into one of those directories. And in my case, I'm going to move it into user local bin. So sudo move the customized binary and then point to user local bin. Now, when I type in a command which customize, meaning I'm asking Linux, hey, if I issue the customize command, which path are you going to use for that? And it comes back and it says user local bin. So we know we're good to go for issuing customized commands. Now, our next step is going to find us using the other feature, the other half of Visual Studio Code. We're going to now start managing text files here on our remote system. So I'm going to start by clicking on new file, and I'm going to say new text file, and I'm going to pass in our very first file here in order to build the Ansible AWX director. Remember to kind of pull in that architect to oversee our construction of AWX. So in order to do that, I type in this command or paste in this text right here. Again, this text is also available on the Ansible AWX in case you like to copy and paste like I do. But it's critical that you save this file as customization.yaml. Don't name it anything other than this. I think you might be able to get away with customization.yml instead of .yaml. But for my sake, it's just I've worked with YAML for the file extension for YAML for a long time, so I'm kind of hard-coded that way. But just make sure that the name of the file is customization, just like I have it spelled here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to kick off the customization binary, point to our local directory, and then pipe that output to the Kubernetes binary called kubectl. At the end of the day, all this is going to do is this is going to kick off the building of our Ansible AWX operator. This is the second to last step before we have a working production environment. All right, so now I can see that we've created some resources within our Kubernetes environment through customize. If I run the command to look at our workloads now, if I type in kubectl get pods, and if I just hit enter right now, it's going to say, hey, there's no resources found in the default namespace, which is true. Because if you look back up to our customization file above, we said we want the name of the namespace to be AWX. So what we need to do with our command is we need to say kubectl get pods -- namespace, and then the name of our namespace, which is AWX. So I'm going to type in that right here. And what we can see is that the Ansible AWX operator is currently being built. Specifically, we can see it say that the container is in the creation phase, and that if you look at the ready column, ready is 0 out of 2. So there's two resources associated to the operator, and neither of them are ready right now. Ultimately, it takes about a minute for the operator to be online and operational. So let's go ahead and hit our up arrow here. We can see that now resources are 2 out of 2 ready and the status is running. So the final step, promise you, the final step to getting the Ansible AWX commands over to the operator is we need to create one more file. And we're going to call this file awx.yaml, and we're going to pass it a few set of instructions. The only thing that I really want you to look at is the very last line. What we're telling Kubernetes is that we want the web service of Ansible AWX to be exposed on port 30,080, right? And now if you, for some reason, have a conflict, something else is running on 30,080 on your Linux machine, wow, what a coincidence. But if you need to, you can make an adjustment here and change it to any kind of a non-standard port. You should be good to go. All right, again, we're going to save this as awx.yaml. You can probably get away with YML. Again, I'm just a little old school, I guess. I'm hard-coded into YAML, so I don't know if I'll ever change that either. But now we have the AWX instructions available. What we now need to do is we need to pass them into that operator. And the way that we do that is we revisit our customization.yaml file, and we will add a new line where we'll give it the name of the file that we just passed in here. So let's go back over into the customization.yaml. On the resources line, let's go ahead and create a new line, hit a dash there to represent a new entry, and then give it the name of the file. In my case, it was awx.yaml. We're going to run that same customize build operation that we had done previously. So you can probably just hit the up arrow inside of your terminal and execute it. And what you'll see is that more resources have been created. Now the AWX operator, those resources were unchanged, and they'll list it here in this output. They'll say, hey, it's unchanged, but all the new stuff that we included in the AWX file is now been incorporated, and it'll say configured here. All right. Now this part of the process will take up to, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes or so for Ansible AWX to fully build. It's going to build databases, it's going to build web applications, it's going to stitch all these things together. It's going to create a destination NAT, again, to let you access AWX on that port of 30,080. There's a lot of things that will be ultimately going on here. And so what I like to do is I like to take this opportunity to open up a new terminal here within VS Code. And I do that by moving to the right of the screen, and you'll see a little plus arrow. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And then I'm going to watch all of the logs that come out of my Kubernetes environment. So specifically regarding the AWX operator. So this is a mechanism for us to kind of sit and watch all the things that are taking place. And once it's complete, we'll know that we're ready to access the system. I like to do this in a separate console. You don't have to, but the command is super long. So again, I just highly recommend you go to the Ansible AWX GitHub, copy the command that they use to view the logs, and you can just kind of follow along as well. All right. Now this is the exact output that we're looking for. Specifically, we want to see the words play recap, and I'll have your local host underneath it and say how many were okay, how many changed, unreachable, and failed. I want you to pay attention to make sure that none of the unreachable column is 0 and the failed column is 0. If either of those are greater than 0, something wrong happened in the install, and you might just have to kind of blow away your AWX operator and redeploy it. But now that we feel like it looks like it's completed, I'm going to again look at the pods within my AWX namespace. And now I can see, in addition to the operator, we also have a Postgres database, and we have an AWX pod, which has got 4 resources currently running inside of it. That's going to be things like its message bus and the web applications and other things. Now, there's one last thing. It's not regarding the building. We've got AWX up and operational right now, but there is a password that was generated during the build process, and we need to ask Kubernetes to reveal that to us. The command is super long. It looks pretty unorthodox if you've never done this type of thing before. So again, go to the AWX GitHub and grab the actual command and paste it into your console. And it's going to come back and present you with your admin password to log into the system. In my case, it starts right here. It started on the same line as my command, so it's a little difficult for us to kind of pull apart, but it is this phrase that I've got listed here under the red highlighting. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that to my clipboard, and we'll use that as our admin password to log into Ansible AWX. Now let's make sure that we can reach this and everything is up and operational. I'm going to open up a new tab. I'm going to type in the IP address of my Linux virtual machine, and again on port 30,080. Here, let me turn off dark mode for a second. There we go. Now we can see that we've got a login prompt. I'm going to type in admin. I'm going to make sure that my password is in my clipboard, because there's no way I'm going to be able to remember this, or at least type it correctly. So let me just go ahead and paste it here and log in. Voila. Okay, very cool. So we can see that we've got Ansible AWX up and operational. We're going to probably end the video right here. I'm not going to go into too much of a setup guide for Ansible AWX, although I'll just leave you with this. Like, usually my preferred way of building a new AWX environment, I start at credentials. Credentials are typically used in almost all the other aspects of like a project or a template, or all these things. So I create credentials for things like my SSH passwords, my SSH keys, my GitHub account, all that type of stuff. And then I'll be able to start provisioning the rest of Ansible AWX out. But that's it. That's it, everybody. I know it took about half an hour for everything to get up and operational, but hopefully this kind of streamlined approach is a little bit easier to digest than the live stream video we did last time. As always, if you run into any problems, if you have any types of challenges, feel free to comment down below. Share your experiences. Were you successful? Did you fail? I'd like to know. There's opportunities I have to help out sometimes. So those comments can kind of help me understand whether or not things are blowing up for you. Again, thanks for taking the time to hang out with me. My name is Calvin, and we'll see you in our next video where we actually go through the setup and instantiation of Ansible AWX for a production ready environment. All right, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.